I never wanted children. Not in the way most women seem to. Dreaming of tiny hands grasping their fingers, imagining first words, first steps, first days of school. My dreams were different. I craved structure, independence, the satisfaction of knowing I had built something of my own. A career, stability, freedom. But Anthony? From the very beginning, he made it clear. Being a father wasn't just a hope, it was a requirement. It was in the way he spoke about it, how his face would light up when he saw kids playing at the park, how he'd mention names he'd picked out years before we even met. At first, I thought it was sweet. Then, it became something else. A weight pressing down on me, a constant reminder that eventually, I'd have to choose between the life I wanted and the life he expected from me. I don't know when exactly I stopped fighting it. Maybe it was exhaustion, the slow erosion of resistance over the years. Maybe I convinced myself that love meant compromise, that if I truly loved him, I could give him this one thing. So I did. I let go of my hesitation, silenced the nagging voice in the back of my mind, and said yes. And for a brief moment, I believed we were stepping into something beautiful together. But the second I saw those 2 pink lines on the test, everything changed. Not for me, for him. The man who once spoke about fatherhood with glowing excitement suddenly became a shadow of himself. He was always busy, always distracted. Work meetings ran late, business trips became more frequent, and whenever I tried to talk about the baby, he'd nod absent-mindedly, as if I were discussing someone else's pregnancy. At first, I told myself it was normal. Maybe he was nervous. Maybe the reality of it all was just sinking in. But the longer it went on, the more I saw the truth. He had gotten exactly what he wanted, and yet somehow I was going through it alone. At night, I lay awake, staring at the empty side of the bed, listening to the silence of a home that no longer felt warm. I tried to tell myself I was imagining things, that he still loved me, that I wasn't just some incubator for the child he had begged for. But the unease sat heavy in my chest, growing like a sickness I couldn't name. Something was wrong. And soon I'd have proof that my instincts had been right all along. I started paying closer attention, not in the obsessive, paranoid way you see in movies, but in the quiet, measured way of someone who knows, deep down, that something is slipping through their fingers. The way Anthony looked at me had changed, or rather the way he didn't look at me. He barely touched me anymore, not even in passing. A hand on the lower back, a brush of fingers against mine. Those small gestures had vanished. When I spoke, he responded, but his eyes were always elsewhere, his body physically present, but his mind leagues away. I told myself he was tired, overwhelmed, that fatherhood had started feeling real to him, and he just needed time to adjust. But then there were the absences, the phone calls he'd take in another room, the way he'd set his phone down screen first, slipping it into his pocket the second I walked in, the unexplained late nights, the vague, dismissive answers when I asked where he had been. Work ran late. Had to meet a client. Got caught up in something. At first I believed him, or maybe I wanted to. I wanted so badly to trust that this was a phase, that he'd snap out of it, that we'd go back to who we were. But trust doesn't work like that, does it? Once it starts to crack, even the smallest things feel like proof of betrayal. One night, I decided to test something. Nothing extreme, just a simple message. Hey, I miss you. Let's grab dinner together tonight? I sent it while he was at work, knowing he'd see it. Hours passed, no reply, not even the usual busy talk later. When he finally came home, much later than usual, I was already in bed, pretending to be asleep. I heard him undress, shuffle around in the dark. Then, the faint glow of his phone screen. A quiet chuckle, a message typed back quickly. Not to me, not to his boss. Someone else. I lay there, heart hammering in my chest, my fingers curling into the sheets. I wasn't stupid. I wasn't imagining this. Something was happening behind my back. And suddenly, I wasn't just a woman carrying a child. I was a woman being lied to. Denial is a funny thing. It lets you rewrite reality, smooth out the rough edges, Tell yourself the story you need to hear. And for a while, I let it cradle me. I told myself Anthony was just distant, not dishonest. That he was stressed, not straying. That I was reading too much into things, letting my hormones distort reality. But deep down, I knew better. There's a difference between a man who is preoccupied and a man who is elsewhere. And Anthony? He wasn't just absent, he was gone. I started noticing little things that wouldn't mean much on their own, but together painted an ugly picture. The cologne he never used before but now wore every time he worked late. The way his phone was always fully charged, despite never seeming to be plugged in at home. The credit card charges at restaurants we had never been to together. And the way his voice softened, just slightly, when he answered certain calls, his tone shifting into something almost intimate. One evening, as he stepped out to grab something from his car, I followed. I don't even know what I was looking for. Maybe just some confirmation, something solid to hold in my hands. And I found it. Sitting there in the passenger seat was a small wallet. Not mine, a woman's. Smooth black leather, expensive. I picked it up, my pulse thrumming in my ears, and flipped it open. Inside, a receipt, a fancy dinner for two. A date I recognized because it was the same night Anthony had told me he was swamped with work, that he barely had time to eat. I felt something in me go still. Not rage, not heartbreak, just a quiet, settling certainty. This was it, the proof I had been waiting for. The confirmation that my instincts had been screaming at me all along. Anthony had begged for a family, pushed me into a life I hadn't been sure I wanted, only to abandon me the second I gave it to him. And now, while I carried his child, he was out there with someone else. I stood there for a long moment, gripping the wallet, my breath measured, my thoughts eerily clear. I didn't cry, I didn't scream. Instead, I did something that surprised even me. I smiled. Because for the first time in weeks, I wasn't confused anymore. I knew exactly what I had to do. I didn't confront him, not yet. I wanted to, God, I wanted to. But something in me held back. Maybe it was the way he walked back inside that night, completely unaware that his carefully constructed lie had just unraveled. Maybe it was the arrogance in his voice when he kissed my forehead and muttered, "Long day at work." Or maybe, just maybe, I wanted to watch him dig his own grave a little deeper before I shoved him in. So, I played my part. I smiled when he looked at me, nodded at his half-hearted apologies, and even let him kiss me goodbye in the mornings. But beneath it all, my mind was sharpening, my instincts honing in on every single detail I had once ignored. His late nights, the hushed phone calls, the sudden, unexplained expenses. He thought he was careful, but men like Anthony always underestimate the women they betray. I started keeping track, a mental notebook of every lie, every inconsistency. And the more I watched, the clearer it became. He wasn't just distracted. He was gone. He had checked out of this life, of this home, of this relationship, and the only thing keeping him tethered was the fact that I hadn't cut him loose. Yet. But before I made my move, I needed more. Cold, undeniable proof. Something that wouldn't just expose him, but destroy him, and I was going to find it. It didn't take long. Men like Anthony are predictable, careless in their arrogance, sloppy in their deceit. He thought he was untouchable, that I was too blinded by pregnancy and love to see what was right in front of me. But I wasn't blind anymore. I was watching, waiting. One afternoon, while he was in the shower, I took his phone. I'd never done it before, not because I trusted him, but because I'd never wanted to be that person. The one who snoops, who digs through messages searching for something they already know in their gut. But this wasn't snooping. This was confirmation. The passcode was the same as always. Arrogant. As soon as the screen unlocked, my breath caught in my throat. He wasn't even trying to hide it. Messages from a saved contact. No fake name, no attempt at subtlety. Marissa. A woman's name. I opened the thread, my fingers ice cold, my stomach tightening with every word. Miss you already. Last night was perfect. Wish I was waking up next to you. She suspects anything? I exhaled through my nose, slow and controlled, willing the fury inside me to stay quiet. I scrolled further, bank transfers, hotel bookings, dinner reservations, all the missing pieces slotting into place, forming a picture so clear it almost made me laugh. This is who you really are, Anthony. This is the man who begged for a family. I placed the phone back exactly where I found it, my hands steady, my face calm. He wouldn't know what I'd seen. Not yet. Because now, it wasn't just about knowing the truth. It was about making him pay for it. Knowing wasn't enough. I needed proof. Proof that couldn't be explained away. Proof that would hold up when it mattered most. So I got smart. If Anthony was going to destroy this family, he was going to do it with his own hands. I started small. A casual question here, a feigned cluelessness there. You've been working so hard lately, I'd say, running my fingers down his arm, watching him stiffen. We should take a trip, just the two of us. Reconnect. He hesitated, forced a smile. You know how things are at work? He muttered, kissing my forehead with all the warmth of a man shaking hands with a business associate. Lies. So many lies. I dug deeper, checked our bank statements, combed through his emails when he left his laptop open. It was all there. Transactions tied to places I'd never been. A second credit card I'd never seen. A hotel room booked for the following week, just for one night. Marissa wasn't just a distraction. She was an investment, and Anthony had been paying for her with the life I helped him build. The final nail came when I followed him. He told me he'd be working late. I smiled, kissed him goodbye, and then I waited. 30 minutes after he left, I got in my car and drove. Not to his office, I already knew that was a lie. Instead, I went to the hotel, the one from the reservation. And there he was, standing outside, waiting. Not for me, for her. She arrived minutes later, tall, polished, younger, laughing at something he said before slipping her arms around his neck like she belonged there. I stayed in the car, watching, absorbing every detail, committing it all to memory. He kissed her, touched her the way he hadn't touched me in months, and then they walked inside together. I should have cried. I should have felt my heart break, but I didn't, because I had all the proof I needed, and now it was time to decide exactly how much I was going to make him suffer. I didn't confront him that night. I didn't throw accusations, didn't scream, didn't cry. What was the point? Men like Anthony don't confess because they're sorry. They confess because they're caught. And I wasn't going to give him the satisfaction of thinking this was just another emotional argument he could wiggle his way out of. No, Anthony wasn't going to see this coming. I drove home, my mind clear, my hands steady on the wheel. The hurt was there, of course it was, but it wasn't consuming. It was sharpening, like a blade being honed. I thought about our conversations, the promises he had made, the life I had sacrificed to build something that, in the end, had been nothing more than a stage for his performance. And now, he thought he could walk away clean, slipping into another woman's arms without consequence? No, he had taken something from me. My time, my trust, my choices. And I was going to take something from him. By the time I pulled into the driveway, I already knew how this would end. The next morning, I woke up before Anthony, lying still beside him in bed, listening to the slow, even rhythm of his breath. He looked so peaceful, so unaware. It almost made me laugh. If only you knew, Anthony. If only you knew what was coming. I slipped out of bed, careful not to wake him, and got to work. My first stop was our financials. I already knew he had a second credit card, one I wasn't supposed to know about, but now I needed to track every dollar, every charge. Every transaction that led straight to Marissa. With every transfer I uncovered, every hotel booking, every late-night dinner, the anger inside me cooled into something else, something strategic. I met with a lawyer that afternoon. I told her everything, the affair, the financial misconduct, the emotional neglect. She listened carefully, nodding as she took notes, and when she finally spoke, her words were exactly what I wanted to hear. You have more than enough to bury him. That night, I played my part perfectly. I kissed Anthony when he walked through the door, let him hold me, let him pretend like nothing had changed. And I smiled, because I knew something he didn't. I wasn't his wife anymore. I was his executioner. The next few weeks were a masterclass in deception. I became the woman he thought I was, the trusting, oblivious wife. I didn't question his late nights, didn't press him when he pulled away. I let him believe he was getting away with it. That I was too blind, too naive, too pregnant to see the truth. And all the while, I was dismantling his life piece by piece. I started with the finances, quietly shifting joint accounts, redirecting assets, ensuring that when the storm finally hit, he'd be standing in the wreckage with nothing left to claim. The lawyer helped me set everything in motion: legal protections, custody filings, airtight clauses that would leave Anthony no room to maneuver. And the best part? He never saw it coming. Then, I turned my attention to her, Marissa. I had been tempted to confront her, to tear her down just as I was doing to him, but why waste my energy? She wasn't the problem. She was just a symptom. But that didn't mean I couldn't use her. A few anonymous messages, a little manipulation. And soon enough, I had her questioning Anthony just as much as I was. Everything was falling into place. The trap was set, the pieces moving exactly where I needed them. And Anthony? He was walking straight into it, smiling like a man who still believed he was in control. Poor thing. He had no idea his life was about to collapse beneath him. I waited for the perfect moment. Not just any day, his birthday. A day he expected to be celebrated, surrounded by love, praised for being the man he pretended to be. It was poetic, really. A man who spent years crafting a facade, only for it to be ripped away in front of an audience. I planned everything down to the last detail. A small dinner at home, intimate and warm. Just the two of us, or so he thought. The air smelled of roasted garlic and wine, the table set beautifully, soft candlelight flickering against polished silverware. I played my role flawlessly, smiling as he walked in, kissing his cheek, pretending to be the devoted wife he no longer deserved. He didn't suspect a thing. He sat down, poured himself a drink, sighed in contentment as he looked around. "This is nice," he said, his voice soft. "Just what I needed." I almost laughed. "Oh, Anthony, you have no idea what you need." And then, as he raised his glass for a toast, I handed him the envelope. "Happy birthday," I said, my voice light, almost sweet. He grinned, tearing it open, expecting a gift, expecting something. But what he got instead was divorce papers, meticulously prepared, legally devastating, and entirely inescapable. The moment his eyes scanned the contents, the shift in his expression was almost comical. Confusion first, then shock. His smile faltered. "What the hell is this?" he muttered, flipping through the pages, his fingers tightening around the paper. I tilted my head, watching him. "It's exactly what it looks like," I said, voice steady. "And before you start lying, don't. I know everything." The blood drained from his face, and that was when the doorbell rang. Anthony barely reacted at first. He just sat there, staring at the divorce papers like they were written in a language he couldn't understand, like his brain was refusing to process what was happening. But the knock at the door shattered the silence, jerking him back to reality. His head snapped up, eyes darting to me, suspicion flickering behind his panic. "Who the hell is that?" His voice was tight, uneven. I took a slow sip of my wine before standing. "Why don't you open it and find out?" He hesitated. For a man who had spent months sneaking around, he suddenly seemed terrified of surprises. Eventually, he got up, shoulders stiff as he made his way to the door. He cracked it open just enough to see who was on the other side, then immediately tried to slam it shut. But it was too late. Marissa stepped in before he could stop her. She wasn't smiling. She wasn't touching him, clinging to him like she had outside that hotel. No, she had a look I recognized. A woman who had finally realized she'd been played. And judging by the way her fingers gripped the folded stack of printed emails in her hand, she had come with receipts. I sat back down at the table, watching the scene unfold with quiet satisfaction. "Anthony," she said, her voice sharp, "you lied to me." Anthony shot me a murderous look like this was my fault. I smiled, resting my chin on my hand. "Oh, Anthony," I murmured. "It seems like someone else knows everything, too." His face turned a shade of red I'd never seen before. Panic. Good. Anthony turned to me first, his eyes blazing with something between desperation and fury. "What the hell did you do?" he hissed, his hands clenched into fists at his sides. I raised an eyebrow, swirling the wine in my glass. "Me?" I asked, feigning innocence. "Oh, darling, I didn't do anything. You did this. I just made sure the right people knew about it." Marissa shoved the printed emails against his chest, her voice shaking, not with sadness, but with rage. "You told me she didn't mean anything to you," she snapped, jabbing a finger in my direction. "That you were leaving her, that you were only staying because of the baby. But these?" She gestured to the papers, her lip curling in disgust. "These say something completely different." I leaned back in my chair, watching him crumble. I had given her exactly what she needed, evidence that she wasn't special, that she wasn't the only one he had been stringing along. It hadn't even been hard. A few forwarded messages, a few well-placed screenshots, and suddenly, the little fantasy Anthony had built came crashing down around him. His throat bobbed as he swallowed, scrambling for an explanation, an excuse, anything that could salvage the mess he had created. But there was nothing. No clever words, no manipulative apologies that could fix this, and I wasn't done. "I've filed for full custody," I said, my voice calm, almost casual. "And don't worry, you'll still get to contribute to our child's life." I smiled, placing my hands on my belly. "Financially, of course." His head snapped toward me. "You can't just—" "Oh, I can," I interrupted smoothly, tilting my head. "And I already have. The lawyer made sure of it. The divorce is airtight. I get everything. The house, the assets, and more than enough support to make sure our child never has to depend on you for anything." I paused, watching his expression darken. "But hey, at least you still have her, right?" Marissa scoffed, shoving past him toward the door. "Not a chance," she spat, turning to him with a glare of pure venom. "You're a liar, Anthony. And now you're broke, too." With that, she was gone. The silence that followed was suffocating. I stood, collecting the empty wine glass, and turned to face him one last time. "Enjoy your birthday, Anthony." My voice was soft, but the weight of finality in it was unmistakable. And then, I walked away, leaving him to drown in the ruins of his own making. The house was quiet, peaceful. For the first time in months, maybe even years, I could breathe. No more waiting for late-night footsteps creeping through the door. No more rehearsing conversations in my head, trying to decode half-truths and carefully crafted lies. Anthony was gone, and with him, the weight I hadn't even realized I was carrying. I sat on the couch, running a hand over my stomach. Our child. Not his. Not anymore. He had given up the right to call himself a father the moment he walked into that hotel with another woman. But that was fine. My baby would never have to know what it felt like to be unwanted, to be a bargaining chip in a relationship built on broken promises. They would be safe, loved, and most importantly, free from him. I wasn't naive. I knew there would be battles ahead. Legal proceedings, financial negotiations, the inevitable last-ditch attempts from Anthony to claw his way back into my life. But he had no power over me anymore. I had stripped him of it, piece by piece, until there was nothing left for him to hold on to. And now, all that was left to do was rebuild. Without him. Anthony tried, of course. Men like him always do. The texts came first. Half-hearted apologies, vague justifications. I was confused. "I didn't mean to hurt you." Then came the bargaining. "We can fix this. Don't do something you'll regret." And finally, the anger. "You can't take my child away from me. You're being cruel." Cruel. That word almost made me laugh, as if I had been the one sneaking around, as if I had been the one turning my back on the life I begged for. But I didn't reply, not once. Silence was the sharpest weapon I had left, and I wielded it without hesitation. Then came the legal blows. My lawyer had warned me that Anthony would fight, that he'd try to twist things in his favor. But he had underestimated me, just like he always had. He didn't realize that while he was busy playing house with Marissa, I was busy making sure he couldn't touch mine. Every dollar hidden, every email exposed, every loophole closed. The judge saw through him in minutes. Full custody was mine. Child support was locked in. The house, the savings, the stability I had built, it was all untouchable. The only thing left for Anthony to do was pay up and disappear. And from what I heard, even Marissa wanted nothing to do with him now. I saw him once, months later. It wasn't planned. I had simply stopped by a cafe after a doctor's appointment, craving something sweet. And there he was, sitting alone by the window, staring at his phone with a look I almost didn't recognize. Hollow. Defeated. He looked thinner, his shirt slightly wrinkled, the sharp confidence he once carried now reduced to something pitiful. His fingers drummed against the table absent-mindedly, his knee bouncing under the weight of stress. A man barely keeping his head above water. I could have walked past him without a word, could have let him sit there in the mess he had made. But some part of me, maybe the part that still wanted him to understand, paused. He must have felt my eyes on him because, slowly, he looked up. Our gazes met, and for the first time in what felt like forever, I saw something real in his expression. Not arrogance, not manipulation. Just the quiet, sinking realization of everything he had lost. He opened his mouth, maybe to speak, maybe to beg, but I didn't let him. I simply smiled. Not cruelly, not vindictively. Just a small, knowing smile, the kind that said, I won. Then, without a word, I turned and walked away. Anthony had finally gotten what he deserved.